Okay, great stuff. Okay then, should we make a start? Welcome everyone to our webinar today. We've got Kyril Whittaker with us, who's recently moved to Vietnam. So he's broadcasting from Vietnam. So fingers crossed for the connection holds. And he's going to be presenting Uncle Ho, The Life of a Revolutionary. From his early life in Vietnam, his extensive journeys around the world, right up to the American War and his death in 1969. So we're having a comprehensive look at the most famous revolutionary, a man apart in the international communist movement. Now, I'm going to share my screen to show Kyril's slides. Good stuff. All right then, Kyril, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to my talk about Uncle Ho. I hope you find it satisfactory. Just a quick disclaimer before I start the talk. Obviously, Uncle Ho lived quite a nice and long life, and a very interesting life at that. He visited lots and lots of countries and did a lot in a lot of places. So this will not be an exhaustive account of his life, of course, but it will nonetheless hopefully be an entertaining account of his life. And it will go through some of the most important aspects of his life, and hopefully some little stories about his life that you may not have heard of or read before, due to a lot of them coming from sources which are hard to get a hold of in the UK, to say the least. So yeah, without further ado, I'll start the presentation. Thank you. Next slide. So Uncle Ho was born in Nghệ An province in 1890 in what was then Annam. Annam was a part of French Indochina. It was a French colonial protectorate in Indochina. Indochina was the name of the territory that France controlled, that is now called Vietnam, and also bits of the surrounding countries as well, like Cambodia and stuff. But it was split mainly into three parts. You had Tonkin, Cochin China, and Annam. And Uncle Ho was born in Annam. Growing up, he witnessed lots of uprisings. It was a very tumultuous time. The Vietnamese people always resisted colonialism from when the French landed and invaded to up until their defeat at Dien Bien Phu. There was always resistance movements going around, but what Uncle Ho noticed growing up as a child was that they didn't have a lot of cohesive organization. They seemed to lack something, these nationalist movements and nationalist uprisings. And he wanted to figure out what that was, so that he could liberate the people and have a free, independent and united Vietnam that wasn't under French control. His father was a big influence in his life in this regard, because he was a big patriot. He was a teacher, and he did himself get in trouble with the colonial government at the time for his views on Vietnam's independence and things like that. There's not a lot written about his father's life in English, and there is conflicting accounts that are written, but most people agree that he did have conflict with the French government at the time because of his patriotic views. Ho Chi Minh was a very intelligent person growing up. He studied very well. You'll be able to read that in all the biographies about him. And in this regard, he ended up teaching in a school before he went to Europe. The school is the one that you see in the picture on this slide. Looks quite nice, and yes, it's still preserved to this day. It's still a place that you can go and visit. and he decided that the best way for him to learn about how to free the Vietnamese people was to actually broaden his horizons and go outside of Vietnam, especially to France, to see how their watchwords of liberty, equality, and fraternity were actually practiced in places outside of Vietnam. Yeah, I'll go on the next slide now, please. So this part is really interesting, and I will not be doing it a lot of justice in just talking about it in a short space of time on this slide. But in this very short period of time, Uncle Ho worked on a boat, and because he worked on a boat, the SS Latouche Travail, he traveled to a lot of places. There's some listed there: Spain, Portugal, Dahomey, Senegal, USA, Congo, also France, and then later Britain, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But in these travels, he witnessed quite a lot of horrific treatment of other exploited colonial people in colonies. For example, when he was working aboard a boat near Africa, he witnessed how black workers were treated as if they'd get into disputes with the owners of the ships. They would sometimes just throw them overboard and let them drown. But that wasn't the worst kind of things he'd see on his travels in these places. When he was in the US, he saw lynchings, and he wrote quite a powerful piece about lynchings. And you can see there on the right-hand side, the Omni Parker Hotel where he worked in Boston. He worked in quite a few hotels in his lifetime, usually as a dishwasher, and then sometime later as a cook, but that would be in Britain. He attended meetings of black workers as well while he was in the US. You'll see this as a theme, even though he wasn't a developed Marxist Leninist yet. He realized that it was always, wherever he went, it was always the working class that was being exploited. Whether he was in Dahomey, the US, Spain, Annam, anywhere he went, he saw how the working class was viciously exploited, especially those in the colonies. So he regularly attended meetings of workers, especially workers who were part of these exploited groups, to see how they organized and to see what they agitated for. I've got a nice little quote here that I took from an article online, which is from an Uncle Ho piece, which isn't translated to English yet, sadly. But it says, "The light emitted from the head of the Statue of Liberty shines out, lighting up the blue sky. But at the foot of the Statue of Liberty, the rights of black people and women were being trampled on. When will the blacks be equal to the whites? When will there be equality among nations? And when will women be equal to men?" Now you can see even this far back, there is some ideological development there that will lead him inevitably to come to his Marxist-Leninist path later on. Next slide. This slide is about his life in the UK. It's what I've been researching quite a lot myself recently, because this isn't really documented about at all. And I think I found where he used to live, the area where he used to live, from one of his old letters that, again, isn't translated into English. But it was a very interesting time. It's here that some writers claim he started to read the works of Marx and Engels. And it is here where his labor organizing flourished more. He went to attend talks of trade union leaders. He went to watch MPs give public speeches and things like that. He arrived on a ferry in New Haven. If you go to New Haven now, there's actually a monument dedicated to Uncle Ho that the Vietnamese embassy cooperated in building. Also, New Haven Museum has some exhibits dedicated to Uncle Ho as well. while he was in Britain, he had quite a few jobs. He worked as a snow sweeper for a school, a waiter, a chef, a dishwasher, and a stoker. Now, I didn't know what a stoker was originally when I first read it in the book, but a stoker just means someone who basically shovels coal to get an engine going. So either on a ferry or a steam engine. I'm guessing, it didn't provide context, but I'm guessing it's while he was on the boat, he was a stoker. As I've said there, he was involved in overseas labour unions, but also there is claims that he supported Irish independence demonstrations. And this is said in a few places, but it's not very well sourced. And there is an author from Ireland who did talk about Uncle Ho weeping when one of a famous Irish revolutionary figure died. However, the time that author says he was in Britain and the time he actually was in Britain don't add up. So I'm not too sure that that claim is entirely valid. But it would not surprise me, given the amount of labour organising he did in the UK, and obviously his patriotism, which he had at that time, and his affinity with exploited peoples. Also, at this time, there was the Thanh Nguyen uprising. Now, this was a short-lived but quite impressive uprising in Vietnam, in which peasants basically seized control of a large area from French colonial forces, and it really worried the French colonial forces at the time. It was kind of like a small working-class revolt at the time. And they started heavily cracking down on people with any kind of revolutionary writings or pamphlets or anything like that after the Thanh Nguyen uprising. I've got a quote here from his letter that I translated. It might not be that accurate seeing as I translated it, but you can see he lived in poverty everywhere he went. He wasn't treated well. He was working class and he was from Annam, so he was treated awfully, and you can read that just here. He says, living in England, it is no different from France, and the days are spent just worrying about getting rid of hunger. Next slide. There we go. This part is really interesting as well. So this is when he was in France and also his time in the Soviet Union. I bunched these two together because I think they're kind of important together. This is when he properly became a Marxist-Leninist. At Versailles, he delivered an 8-point demand for the independence of Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. It wasn't a radical demand. It wasn't purely that the Vietnamese should completely govern themselves or anything like that. It was a very slight demand, but nonetheless, the Versailles Conference completely ignored it. But that didn't mean that it didn't have an effect, though. It was widely reported and spread through pamphlets of Vietnamese patriots that were all over the world at the time. And this is really when France and other countries started paying massive attention to this man as someone who could potentially cause a lot of trouble and could inspire future uprisings in different parts of French Indochina. He joined the French Communist Party when he was there, and his ties to the French Communist Party go even further than this. They basically go towards the end of his life. He made friends with people such as Pablo Picasso, who regularly drew and painted things for the Vietnamese people and also for Uncle Ho. One of his drawings, which was talked about quite a lot, is sadly lost. It was lost in the bombings in Hanoi, but they were close friends because of their relationship to the French Communist Party, and it's not a fact that a lot of people know about Uncle Ho. He regularly published a lot when he was in France as well. Most of the stuff you'll read translated in English about Uncle Ho from the period before he got back to Vietnam and started organizing in the Viet Minh and stuff like that is stuff that he produced in his pamphlets while he was in France and published in the French Communist Party's journal Le Humanité. These kind of pamphlets and things like that were constantly reporting to people all around the world, and especially in France, the indignities that the Vietnamese people had to suffer at the hands of the French colonialists, and obviously pointed out that these kinds of things had a class element and a class structure to them. Some of them are very, very brutal and not very nice reading. He went to the Soviet Union eventually after attending the Tours Congress, and he joined the University of the Toilers of the East, and he actually wrote quite a beautiful long article. If anyone wants access to that, please feel free to try and contact me at the end. I'm available everywhere, but it's only been published in one place so far, which is sad. But that article talks about how amazed he was living in this university in the Soviet Union and seeing how much democracy the Soviet Union had compared to anywhere else he'd been, compared to the UK, compared to France, compared to his home in Annam. It was amazing. The people of the university were, as the name suggests, they were from other countries, especially exploited colonial countries. But they controlled the university, basically. They had elected councils, Soviets, if you will, that basically decided different things. They learned and looked after, they learned agricultural production and stuff like that, and had their own little farm, as well as obviously learning things to do with revolutionary theory and basic subjects and things like that. It's an amazing article, and yeah, if you ever do get a chance, be sure to read that. I just put at the end of the bullet points there as well. While he was in France, he worked as a photographer's assistant and a painter of Chinese antiques. Chinese is in quotation marks there because it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't really Chinese antiques. It was, it was just antiques. But he often used disguises like this from this point onwards. And even further back, when he was in Britain, he changed his name just because he knew how dangerous it was for him as someone who opposed the French colonial government back home. And he knew by this point as well that the French secret police were following him around, and in other countries he went to, he would be followed by other secret police too. You can see here his ideological development as well in this quote, which is a very famous quote from him. At first it was patriotism, not yet communism, which led me to have confidence in Lenin, in the Third International. Step by step, during the course of the struggle, by studying Marxism-Leninism while engaging in practical activities, I gradually understood that only socialism and communism can liberate the oppressed nations and working people throughout the world from slavery. His reading of Lenin's works on colonialism really encouraged Uncle Ho to take the Marxist-Leninist path, because in his own words, it's what made the most sense to him. It's the magical thing that he spotted was missing from those earlier nationalist uprisings in Annam. It was that they didn't have the analysis that Lenin and other people had of the colonial question. Next slide, please. He then traveled to China, and he would go back to China several times in his life. But this early time, he worked as an interpreter for Borodin, the Soviet advisor to the Kuomintang. He documented the work of Peng Pai too, who you may or may not know. But Peng Pai was a early leader of the Chinese Communist Party, who placed great importance on the inclusion of the peasantry in the revolutionary masses. Peng Pai started
It looks like Kyril's frozen there. Just give it a second.
he didn't speak to them how they wanted to be understood, and the more time he spent with the peasants and the working class of China, the more his views developed. And I think Peng Pai is a really interesting person to highlight here, because I think Peng Pai, the study of him at least that Ho Chi Minh did in China, would have greatly influenced his emphasis on the peasantry in his revolutionary activities in Vietnam. Also, while in China, he established the League of Revolutionary Youth. The Revolutionary Youth League used to train up cadres in Marxism-Leninism and send them back to Vietnam to organize. And it was a greatly successful venture for quite a number of years. And it resulted in not only large numbers of people becoming Marxist-Leninists in Vietnam, but also organization of workplaces and things like that. Basically what the French colonialists feared a couple of slides ago, that this man would start the basis for an uprising or a revolution was kind of coming true here. Although, as we will learn soon, there were fractions and splits that did happen. It was not perfect, as no revolution is. When Chiang Kai-shek established power in China, this is when Uncle Ho had to flee to Hong Kong to make sure that, you know, he was protected and that he could carry on his revolutionary work from somewhere else. And the quote on this slide that I've chosen is one from his essays on education. So he says, "They are like lame chickens pecking at the husking mill. They make no effort and satisfy themselves with the food they are given. It is therefore our duty to introduce them to revolutionary theory." And in this quote, you can see that Uncle Ho at the beginning laid quite an emphasis on the fact that the people in Annam were kind of they were very much propagandized into believing that nothing could ever change, that no revolution would ever occur. It sounds kind of familiar, right? But his emphasis was that, you know, things can change, and what we need in this is more introduction of revolutionary theory and more organization. As Kwame Ture said, organization, organization. Next slide, please. So this slide is quite important in the history of the Vietnamese Communist Party. He ended up in Hong Kong forming the Vietnamese Communist Party, because what happened was, at the time, there was two different splits going on. So the Revolutionary Youth League I mentioned earlier noticed that it was being filled mainly by students and teachers and professors, and not by workers and peasants, the people they were aiming to capture in. So they started to try and, in their own words, proletarianize the Revolutionary Youth League. But this led to problems and disputes over how best to do it and where to do it best. And it led to an imbalance of membership. The North was really strong, the center and the South not so much. And then the next split that you had was each individual part of Indochina had its own version of a communist party. So you had Annam, you had Tonkin, and you had Cochin China. So the establishment of the, and they regularly had disagreements. So the establishment of the Communist Party of Vietnam was in order to kind of group these organizations together for greater organization across the entire country, and to make sure that that they had a greater effect, basically, and greater numbers, and that the things that were going to be debated were going to be debated internally. In this time, 1927 to 1930, he attended the League Against Imperialism conference with the Japanese Communist Party leader Sun Katayama. This was in the Soviet Union, I believe, although don't quote me on that. I haven't noted it down, which I should have done. But there's a nice story about Sun Katayama. He gives his, it wasn't like a first class ticket, it was like a higher ticket on the train to Uncle Ho, because Uncle Ho couldn't afford to get to the conference. So Sun Katayama ended up giving him his ticket instead. He also, in this time, traveled through fascist Italy. I've put in brackets there, tricking police as well, because he did encounter the police there, and he ended up successfully lying about his identity and making the police, who were informed about an Annamese man that may be traveling through those parts, who is a revolutionary, that he was no threat or anything like that. So he thankfully got through, and he also visited Switzerland, Thailand, and India in this time. A lot of documents from India, again, are not translated, but some of them talk about Uncle Ho, or at least mention a Vietnamese man at this time coming to India to attend various lectures. He returned to China from Thailand, and there you go, I said, to stop the League of Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth from splitting, and formed the Vietnamese Communist Party. The quote here is one that I wanted to put about India, because he did write quite a lot about India, but again, it's only translated in one place, Foreign Languages Press, new volume, on Ho Chi Minh's collected works. And he says here, imperialist capitalism not only exploits Hindu women as mere working flesh, but also as a meat for pleasure, and this in a most despicable way. The English imperialists imposed forced prostitution in the colony. This is the state of Western civilization. This forced prostitution, if any of you have looked back at colonial projects before, is quite a common thing, and it did happen in Vietnam with the French, later with the Americans and the Japanese fascists, and America's allies in the American War in Vietnam, like South Korea and Australia as well, which became a big problem after independence, because they had to basically help the entire prostitute population that the Americans and Australians and Allied forces had created there, and find them jobs, healthcare, and suitable housing. Next slide, please. This part is about the first time he was imprisoned. When he was in Hong Kong, establishing the Communist Party of Vietnam, he was raided at his offices by the Hong Kong police, because they were under the assumption that he might have been starting to foment a revolution there, which is kind of lucky for Uncle Ho in one way, because this charge obviously didn't stick, and he did end up getting free eventually, because that's not what he was planning. He was planning a revolution in French Indochina, not in Hong Kong. A little known fact is a lawyer, an English lawyer called Henry Loserby, helped him to win his freedom, and even there is letters sent by the monarch at that time as well about the case, which is really interesting. I can get them photographs up again if anyone wants the photographs of them letters. But while he was in prison, the French colonialists, having the previous rebellions and the uprisings and the massive strength and organization of the Vietnamese at that time, decided that it would be a good idea to falsely print news of his death, so that they could be saddened and then eventually fall into disorganization, and then they would have the colony back as it was. But this didn't really work, and it was a tactic that was later tried by the Americans too, which did not work as well. But he did eventually win freedom thanks to Losaby, and he returned to China disguised in wealthy attire. In 1935, he went back to the Soviet Union and he studied at the Lenin School. The Lenin School mainly taught Marxist-Leninist theory. I think as well, it was the Lenin School at which he lectured as well, although I'm not too sure. That might have been the University of the Toilers of the East. I will have to look at that again. Apologies for not having the facts to hand. And then between 1936 and 1939, helped organize against fascism and Trotskyism, because both were having significant effects on the organization of the Vietnamese Communist Party and causing trouble all over Vietnam. Fascism for obvious reasons, Trotskyism also for obvious reasons. And they did win against both sides, obviously, eventually kicking out the fascists and establishing for a time their own state, and kicking out the Trotskyists and establishing a coherent state, one that actually worked. The quote here is one that I think best epitomizes this part of his life when he was in prison and the Democratic Front. It is only through daily struggle and work, when the masses of the people have acknowledged the correct policies and leading capacity of the party, that it can be in a leading position. And yeah, on the right-hand side is the picture of the prison he stayed, Victoria Prison. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is his second imprisonment. His second imprisonment was in China. He worked a lot in China with the Chinese Communist Party, and he even held positions in the Chinese Communist Party. He worked with the 8th Army and was elected leader for propaganda and culture work in his unit. And that involved regularly listening to radio stations and newspapers and reporting things back, and also doing regular writing at this time. He was elected General Secretary of his party cell, and he, sorry, lost my train of thought. So yeah, he returned to Vietnam in 1941 disguised as a Chinese journalist. And there's a funny story about this. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long with this, by the way, comrades. I just like to get these stories in because not many people have heard them. But there's a funny story about this. So he was with Pham Van Dong and Vo Nguyen Giap, which you see on the picture on the right, and he was returning again as a Chinese journalist to Vietnam in disguise. And obviously he had to talk in Chinese throughout the entire trip, as did his comrades. Now, a comrade who's not pictured here, he's called Phang Va Huan. When they were traveling, he was smoking and he accidentally dropped the cigarette on his shirt. Now the cigarette set his shirt on fire, and Ho Chi Minh noticed and then started shouting in Vietnamese, "Your shirt's on fire, your shirt's on fire, put it out." And then they all looked at each other and all started laughing because they'd just blown their cover. But luckily no one was around. So yeah, that's a nice little funny story. when he returned to Vietnam, he did his resistance work from Pak Bo Cave, and this is when he started to really build up the fighting forces to fight back against French colonialism. And he did a lot of his writing in these places as well. Again, it wasn't the nicest place, and he didn't have a lot to eat, neither did his comrades. They all sufficed on very little rice rations a day, and had to sleep on stone and things like that. It wasn't nice. But you can still visit some of these caves and streams, which Uncle Ho named to this day. I think Lenin River is one of them. He returned to China, and then he was captured by the Kuomintang. And he wrote his prison diary, or some of it, while he was there, which is really good read. That is available pretty much everywhere. If you like poetry, I urge you to read it. But even if you don't, it's quite inspiring, some of the things he writes while he's imprisoned. He wrote some when he was imprisoned by the Kuomintang, and also when he was in Victoria. And here's part of the prison diary, one of his analyses of prisoners. Nothing but skin and bone remained of him. He slept close to my side only last night, but misery, cold, and hunger were the end of him, and this morning gone he was to the world of eternal night. He witnessed, obviously, while in prison, in both times, horrific treatment of prisoners and horrible abuse, and it left him barely able to walk. So after his stunts in prison, he would have to, get used to walking again. And to do that, he would walk up big mountains with his comrades with a large stick. But whilst he was in prison, he never gave up hope, and his prison diary reflects that. And he even helped other prisoners to write petitions who, weren't very literate, for their freedom and things like that. Next slide, please. This is a very important part, but I can't really drone on too much about it, because the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is a very important date in Vietnamese history, and also the defeat of fascism happened at this time as well. So, the defeat of fascism, I gather most people know details about, and to some extent, hopefully, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. But the important facts are, as I've listed here, in 1944, they formed the Armed Propaganda Brigade for the Liberation of Vietnam. In 1945, the Japanese army collapsed, and they had a struggle for national independence, which led to the 1945 August Revolution, in which Uncle Ho at Ba Binh Square declared independence from French colonialism. However, this didn't last very long, because French colonialism, backed by the British colonists, and also by some fascist forces who were left remaining, to win back Vietnam for France, which resulted in lots of battles, which eventually culminated in the victory at Dien Bien Phu. I put there as well the 1949 Sixth Party Congress addressed issues with Vietnam. The different congresses are really interesting reading if you have the time. There's lots of debates at the time, and lots of self-criticism, because self-criticism was an important part, and still is to this day, of the Communist Party of Vietnam. So I think the Sixth Party Congress especially was really critical, and it's a really good read to read the documents from there, to see how seriously they were taking self-criticism at the time, and admitting where they were wrong and how to fix it. 1954, they won the Battle at Dien Bien Phu. Again, I won't go into much detail, but it was an amazing victory, won under the generalship of Vo Nguyen Giap, Vietnam's most famous general, and they basically trounced the French forces. And the French forces were overly confident at the time, because they believed that the Vietnamese forces, being not as technologically equipped as they were with modern planes and things like that, would easily lose. But they underestimated the strength and the determination of the Vietnamese people. The Vietnamese hauled massive guns up muddy hills with rope, 10 men either side, just to get them to the battlefield. And it is the French colonialist forces' underestimation of the Vietnamese forces and their underestimation of how well their tactics and organization was that resulted in their defeat at the Dien Phu. In 1950, no, not in 1956, sorry, later on in 1954, the Geneva Conference then partitioned Vietnam into two zones. Now, this was only a temporary fix. It was meant to be until an election that was meant to be held in 1956, although you'll soon see what happened to that election. It did not happen. And there's a nice quote here, which is from the Declaration of Independence, the Vietnamese one, which says, "From now on, we break of all relations of a colonial character with France." And on the left-hand side is a picture of Uncle Ho, Vo Nguyen Giap, and other comrades at Dien Phu Operations Command. Next slide, please. This is the final segment of Uncle Ho's life. 1956, the US deliberately ignores the Geneva Convention. And this is for a very important reason. As President Eisenhower admitted himself, and I quote, "Had elections been held at the time of fighting, possibly 80% would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh." They couldn't let that happen, obviously. So they deliberately went against the Geneva Convention and installed their own puppet fascist dictator, Ngo Dinh. And if you want to learn more about him, just search about the awful, well, I mean, there's lots of things that happened at that time. The strategic hamlets, the way prisoners were treated, the horrific treatment of Buddhists and other religious groups in Vietnam. It was a very, very horrible time. But you see later on, as Felix Green noted in this period, they had a kind of turntable because Ngo Dinh became very unpopular with the Vietnamese people for obvious reasons. So then they installed another person. They had a coup and they installed another person. And then they kept having more and more and more and more people, and right up until the end, it was a complete farce. As I mentioned there, the coup to remove Dien. There was also the quote-unquote Gulf of Tonkin incidents. These are demonstrably false, but they are the main reason that the US cited at the time to enter the war in Vietnam. And they were already massively involved. They already had troops on the ground. They were already being involved in the strategic hamlet programs. They were already being involved in using their forces to train the South Vietnamese forces. They were arming them. They were spending millions of tax dollars, perhaps billions, I can't remember at the time, on the war in South Vietnam. And 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin was a silver kind of bullet that they created themselves to push their troops inside to try and get this over and done with once and for all, and gain their own sphere of influence in Southeast Asia to counter the rising revolutionary tide that was sweeping all of Asia at the time. So the US war turned into a local war in 1965. In 1969, they had revolutionary government, which you'll know in derogatory terms as the Viet Cong, but the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam were the revolutionaries of South Vietnam. And despite all the rhetoric around them, they weren't originally just a purely communist organization. They were made up of people from across the political spectrum, across the religious spectrum, to reunite Vietnam. And then sadly in September 3rd, 1969, Uncle Ho passed away before he could see the reunification of Vietnam. During quotes, which is quite often quoted in Vietnam on posters and in media, is this one below. Our mountains will always be, our rivers will always be, our people will always be. The American invaders defeated, we will rebuild our land 10 times more beautiful. Next slide, please. And that's exactly what they did from 1975 to today. Obviously, I'm lucky to be in Vietnam at the moment to see how 10 times more beautiful it was. But their struggles did not stop when the Americans left, of course. The Americans imposed heavy embargoes, which really, really restricted Vietnam's access to outside markets, even with the help of the Soviet Union. If you've studied Cuba in detail, you know how bad these types of embargoes can really be. It affects medical equipment and food and all sorts of things. But it did achieve unification, and Saigon, the former colonial city, was renamed after Uncle Ho, called Ho Chi Minh City now. 1978, they were forced into another war, this time with Cambodia. Not with the Cambodian people, of course, but with Pol Pot's clique, who claimed power in Cambodia and started massacring people. Then later on in 19 of the Cambodian War, there was the Chinese-Vietnamese border war, which of course complicated things even more. Bear in mind, they had just started to try and clean up after 1975 the French and the Vietnamese, the American wars, and now they were fighting the Cambodian and the Chinese war. But they eventually ended, and they did start to rebuild. They rebuilt under the leadership of the Communist Party of Vietnam and its General Secretary, Le Yun. Le Yun, I did write a review recently. He's one of my favorite figures, although he's not very well remembered because, of course, at this time, as I've said, Vietnam underwent a lot of hardship, economic and health and all areas. It was horrible. Well, when Le Yun passed away, they initiated, and these reforms basically were to ensure that the Vietnamese economy progressed, but also so that they could try and open up and gain some kind of investment. They were literally being strangled. Yun is not remembered so fondly because he was under the period before Doi Moi, but it allowed other countries to start trading with Vietnam and resulted in the US trade embargo being lifted, which greatly freed. Something that went into the Doi Moi reforms was based on things like Lenin's new economic policy. It was to try and ensure that the building of socialism is protected in Vietnam, whilst allowing for some of the structure of the economy. And there's some quite good articles on it. If you look at the Vietnamese Communist Review called Tap Chi Tong San, if you look on there, there is quite a lot of good articles on it. And again, I could provide them if you want. But if anyone ever says to you, oh, Vietnam is going down the capitalist road, you can quite easily dismiss that by just looking at how they initiated Doi Moi and how they're initiating it today. Just last year, the current General Secretary, President and Prime Minister were elected in the Vietnamese Communist Party. Nguyen Phu Trong is still President. General Secretary is now Nguyen Xuan Phuc, and I think the Prime Minister is Pham Binh Minh, if I remember correctly. I had a long day, sorry, comrades. And yes, that is the end of my presentation. You can go on to the next slide for the quotes. References, sorry. And if you want access to any of these, I can try and get you access to any of these. And then next slide, there is some assorted biographical and non-biographical sources which I used for this presentation. The most important one I will just quickly mention is Stories Told on the Trail, which was actually written by Uncle Ho himself and is really hard to get. If you want access to that, I have uploaded a copy to a Google Drive, and I can give you that straight away if you want access to it. Anyway, thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I didn't miss anything out that you thought was important, but maybe you'll raise them in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyril. That was great.